Hello, I'm Dee Riley, and very warm welcome to another edition of People and Politics. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to my show. I'd be very grateful. Many would argue that there's more poverty and destitution in our communities now than there's been for perhaps a generation. And nobody would understand that better than the Trussell Trust. They are responsible for a series of food banks up and down the country that provide food and essentials for many thousands of people. Joining me today's show is Dr. Helen Barnard. She's head of research and policy at the Trussell Trust. And today we're going to talk about poverty, some of the roots of poverty, and what the new government need to do to try and address the situation. So, welcome to today's edition of People and Politics. Helen, thank you very much for coming on the show and doing this. I'm very grateful for your time.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you, David.
Thank you. I feel that we meet at quite a prominent time because the health secretary uh, was on television yesterday defending the government's decision to withdraw winter fuel payments. I've just been watching the General Secretary of the TEC have a right go at the government for that very policy. Is that going to plunge a lot more people into food poverty this winter?
So I think we need to be quite careful in how we think about this. So the winter fuel payment, because it's universal, it obviously goes to a kind of big group of people who are really struggling and really need it. It also goes to quite a big group of people who aren't struggling and don't particularly need it. So I know quite a few older people who have been saying for years, I don't understand why I get this.
Yeah.
I think the difficulty that the government, and I think we need to, think about the context, which is the government have come in and are facing an incredibly difficult environment.
Yeah.
The kind of financial pressures on the government, the gaps in funding. It is genuinely a very tough situation. And also, when you look out at the country, actually the position that a lot of people in, and to be honest, working age households, the degree of hardship facing working age households who have never had the winter fuel allowance is incredibly worrying and has reached the scale of hunger and of hardship that we're seeing is beyond anything I think any of us could have foreseen 10 years ago. So that sense of the government needs to think very, very carefully, I think, about how they're using the resources they have, and they need to target those resources as much as they can on people who are facing the sharpest end of hardship and poverty.
You've just said that there's more people facing poverty than would ever have imagined. And I suppose I wanted you to first sort of can I set the scene because you're director of research and policy at the Trussell Trust. I imagine a lot of people will know about the Trussell Trust, but some people might not. And I wonder if you would set the scene, give us a bit of context.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Trussell Trust, so we're an anti-poverty charity, And we support about 1,400 food bank centres across the UK. And we're really trying to do two things at once in partnership with our network. We are there to support people in the here and now who are facing really difficult circumstances, people who are finding almost all cases for people who are referred to us, their incomes are so low they can't afford the essentials that all of us need.
Right.
So our food banks are there in their communities, week in, week out, helping people both with the immediate of an emergency food parcel, but actually it's so much more than that, because what food banks are providing is a place to go and people, volunteers and staff who people can sit and talk to. So you come in and we talk a lot about the cup of tea. So you sit down, you have a cup of tea with somebody, and you can chat with them about what is going on in your life, what is difficult, what are the reasons that you have found yourself with nowhere else to turn. Because in most cases, people are coming to the food bank having already often been going without things, been skipping meals, they're already in debt, they're already behind with bills,
Um,
and they have put off coming. So people in the food bank will sit down, talk to somebody. Just being listened to is often quite a new experience for some people in that situation. But what that also enables them to do is to help connect people with support and services locally that can help them with some of the underlying things. So the majority of food banks in our network now will be able to connect somebody with somebody often in who's sitting in the food bank who can advise them about benefits and debt and financial, the financial challenges. They will be able to connect them with housing advice. Often they will be very well linked into things like domestic abuse programs locally, to addiction services, to mental health services. So they try and connect people with the kind of support that will help them not to have to turn to a food bank in the future. And at the same time, with our network nationally, we are doing research to understand what's the scale, what's the nature of hunger in the UK, why are so many people in this position, and identifying what are the policy changes that, if we could achieve them, would mean that people would no longer need to turn to food banks, that we could start. I mean, shutting ourselves down is our ultimate goal, is not to exist, because nobody needs to turn to a food bank because they are getting the help and support that's right for them early enough in the right way, and they don't reach that point of crisis, which is often what a trip to the food bank is arising out of.
sure, I see that, and that I and I'm sure a lot of other people uh, uh, think of food banks as something that evolved over the last 15 years, particularly since the Conservatives got into government in 2010. But I think I'm right in saying that the Trussell Trust was founded long before that, as far back as 1997. But so why have we seen this kind of exponential, almost explosion in food poverty and the people needing to use food banks?
Yeah, you're right. So yes, it was founded back in 97. Initially, actually, it was a project supporting people in Bulgaria. Um, it was trying to improve the lives of around 60 children who were sleeping in a railway station in Bulgaria. And it was a legacy left by Carol Henderson's mum, Betty Trussell. And then Carol and Paddy Henderson used it to set up this project, just trying to help these 60 children that their mum had been so concerned about. What then happened was, it was in 2000, so about 3 years later, Paddy Henderson got a call from a mother in Salisbury, which is where they lived, who was struggling to afford food and struggling to support her children. Um, and he then obviously thought, hang on a minute, we're supporting people in Bulgaria. How is it there are people in my hometown who aren't able to, feed their families? And so that started. So Salisbury Food Bank, the first one, started in Paddy's garden shed in his garage.
Wow.
Um, And then it spread particularly through church networks. So still a lot of our food banks have grown out of churches and are supported by churches. But it is obviously much wider than that. But you're right, it has been in the last probably 10 years, particularly last 5 years, that we've seen the scale of the need out there just go up incredibly. So we've seen in the last 5 years, the number of emergency food parcels we've had to provide has almost doubled. So last year it was 3.1 million food parcels. Paddy Henderson out of his garage would never have imagined that in this day and age we would have that many people. And we've actually, you can see the same patterns in other research. So the Joseph Rowntree Foundation does research into destitution, and they have seen this incredibly sharp rise in the numbers of people in destitution, 2.5 times, going up by 2.5 times between 2017 and 2022. So this is a kind of a real trend out there in communities, and people can see it. When you talk to people, so many people now will know somebody who is struggling to get by, who has had to turn to a food bank, who can't keep up with the bills. So you ask why. So what is it that's happening? And
Yeah,
probably two or three big things that are driving this. So the single biggest factor is that our social security system, which is supposed to be the system that when times get tough, we can all turn to it, that has been eroded and weakened to the point that we had research just last week where we found people who are getting universal credit, about half of them had run out of food and couldn't afford more in the previous month. So the adequacy of that system, so both being able to get the support you need quickly enough, and particularly for disabled people, getting access to disability benefits can take so long, and people are completely desperate in the meantime. But even when you get that support, the actual amount of payment you get isn't linked to how much essentials cost. It's very odd, but there's no link there at all. And so over a number of years, you've had various freezes and cuts and changes, cost of living's risen.
yeah,
Um, so
sure.
that amount of money you're getting week in, week out is about £30 short of what you would need every week to cover essentials. So that is the single biggest thing. But on top of that, you've got people who are in insecure, low paid jobs. So they're in work, but we're finding, our research last week, people in work and on universal credit topping up low earnings
Mm-hmm.
are nearly as likely to be going out without essentials as people who are out of work and in that position. So work is not protecting people.
Yeah.
And housing costs, rent, that's the other big, big driver. So people who are facing rents that are going up and up that are unaffordable, so they're having to cut back on food to try and stave off homelessness, essentially. So those are some of the big things that have happened.
It's just so incredibly sad, isn't it? And the, I was just wondering as you're talking, do you think the average people are the sort of middle classes, and then do you think many of them have a conception of the incidence on rates of poverty that we now see in our communities?
I mean, it's interesting. So we've done quite a lot of research with the public in the last year or so. And one of the things that I actually think is really encouraging is that we now have the vast majority of the public, so kind of 7 in 10-ish, um, agreeing that poverty is a big issue for the country, knowing that it's getting worse, believing that it is not right. The vast majority of the public don't think we should need food banks in a society as wealthy as ours. And actually, the vast majority want the government, believe it is the government's role to step in and start making the changes here. So there's actually a real basis of public understanding and support now, which I'm not sure we've had if you go back 10, 15 years, I'm not sure that was there. Now I think the public are much more aware and people see it. I think people see in their communities, they see people struggling to a degree that I don't think was the case in the past.
No, I think. that I think what really goes me, and I'm sure a lot of other people, is the amount of people that are actually in work, but still in desperate poverty. And you know the Conservatives, back in 2010, their whole mantra was like work must pay and work must, and so with it not paying, and people sort of cannot afford the basics, and essentially that goes you as much as anybody else, and so. so so I was glad to know what are some of your key areas of research at the moment.
Um, so in terms of what research we're doing, there's probably a couple of different things that we're focusing on. Um, so we're doing research to understand in more detail how many people are facing hunger and hardship, because we have the data for how many people come to our food banks, and there's some other research around, but we know there's an awful lot of people who have not yet reached out to either ourselves or any other charitable food provider, but are really struggling. So we're doing some research to understand in more detail the kind of scale and shape of this issue. But we're also focusing a lot of what we're doing on thinking about what are the policies that would make a difference to this, and how much impact would different policies have, and who would they help. Because we're in a situation now which is quite interesting, where we have a government that's just come into power who in their manifesto said that one of their goals is to end the need for emergency food, and described food banks as a moral scar on our society. Now, we haven't had, in any previous governments, people who have come in being that explicit about this problem. And they also said that they want to look at how universal credit can be reformed to better tackle poverty. Now, that's obviously quite broad. We haven't seen any detail, but that is a basis to build on. So what we want to do now is to make sure that they are taking the steps that will have the greatest impact. And we are able to kind of lay out, here are the things that would make a difference, to kind of help them deliver on that and hold them to account. Part of our role as a charity on behalf of the people we serve is to hold whatever government it is to account for whether they are taking action or not. And, we will do that without fear or favour of who's in power. Throughout, this parliament, we will be continuing to kind of bang the drum for this is the problem, this is the solution.
Yeah, it's good to hear that the new government at least have uh, have the willingness, or appears to be, to 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 redress the problem, because it's in like a stark contrast from the previous government, because I think I'm correct in saying that back in 2017, for example, that Jacob Rees-Mogg was recorded saying that he found the use of food banks to be generally heartwarming, and that hopefully shows the difference in attitudes and the difference in approach to tackling poverty.
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting. So my experience over the last decade is there are people in every political party who do really care about this issue. So throughout the previous few governments, there have been people that I've been talking to and working with who absolutely get what we're saying, and they know it's a problem and they want to make a difference. And we saw, so we've seen, we saw some things happen under previous governments which were definitely helping. So, back during the pandemic, some people might remember that the then government raised universal credit by £20. Now that was a big jump to make. It doesn't sound like much, but for people who were struggling to afford the basics, that £20 was phenomenal.
Yeah,
That,
was that really a big difference? Because really, because that because like you have like 20 quid, big deal, but you're saying that's a big change for a lot of people.
It really was. So while that was in place, that £20 uplift, it had, you could see from the research that's been done after that by a lot of academics, it really did help to tackle destitution, child poverty, the need for food banks. So that was something that it was only temporary. And we, like many others, fought hard to keep it, and we lost that battle. But it was, for the time it was in place, it was significant. We did also have, actually, under the last government, what they call cost of living payments. So for a couple of years, there were these payments coming out 3 times a year to
Yeah.
people on certain benefits. Now, that was really interesting because we could see in our data, every time a cost of living payment went out, you could see the numbers of people having to turn to food banks went down pretty much straight away. But it went up again after about 3 weeks. And that's, of course, because if your income is too low every week to afford essentials, you get that extra money and it really helps. People were buying food, buying other essentials, paying down a bit of debt. But it on its own, a one-off payment doesn't fix the problem that your regular income is too low. But it was a really interesting, almost test case. If you inject a bit more money into people's pockets, they spend it on food and essentials and paying debts, and they stop coming to food banks as soon as they can.
Wow.
But it has to be regular. So those cost of living payments, they weren't the solution we would have chosen, because we would have wanted something that's much more regular so people can plan, but they really helped for the time they were in place.
What are some of the policies that you would like to see put into place to stop people in perpetual poverty? Yeah. Presumably things like the £20 uplift.
Yeah, so people will know there is a budget coming up at the end of this October.
Yeah.
Um, we know that it is going to be a tough budget. There are going to be lots and lots of fights over it. So what we've been saying to government is, we understand things are tight, but we have 2 or 3 things we would like to see you do in this first budget, which are not, in the grand scheme of things, massively expensive, but would really help and would be a first step towards that commitment they made in the manifesto. So the biggest thing that we're saying to them is, going back to this issue of social security being inadequate and there being no link within the system between how much essentials cost and the actual money you get. So the thing that we want to work towards over the next few years is what we've called an essentials guarantee. So the idea, you would put into law that universal credit and similar benefits would always at least cover the cost of essentials, and you would have an independent commission or organisation that would assess annually, say, what that level was. Now, that is going to take some time to get to.
Yeah.
But what we're saying is, in this very first budget, they can put into place already a minimum protected floor, so a level below which universal credit payments cannot fall. And they could start that at a lower level than we would ultimately like.
Mm-hmm.
But what it would do immediately is, at the moment, so that when you get your universal credit, many people, more than half of those coming to us who are on universal credit, don't get the whole amount. That inadequate amount doesn't make it to them because they are having money knocked off by the government to pay back debts, most of which are to the government. So you have to wait 5 weeks for universal credit payment. You take out effectively a loan that they call an advance from the government. You then have to pay it back by having lower universal credit. And what we've found is that when you look at the people that we are supporting, if you're somebody who is having those deductions made, you are massively more likely to be going hungry, to be missing out on essentials, to be getting into other debt because you haven't got the money to pay bills. So we're saying, in this budget, bring in a minimum protected floor that would immediately limit how much money can be knocked off your benefits for debt deductions or for the benefit cap. Now, that would be really quite inexpensive for the government from their point of view. It's not actually putting lots more money into the system. It's making sure more of the money already in the system makes it into people's pockets. And it would be a first step towards that essentials guarantee, saying below this level, we will not allow anyone to fall. So that's the kind of one thing. And there's a couple of other things which are really about not reducing the support already there.
Right.
So for people who are paying rent in the private rented sector, if you're on a low income, you get help through what's called the local housing allowance. Now that, back in the day, years ago, that was always supposed to be set at a level that would cover the cheapest, say 30% of rents in your area. Previous successive governments froze that level, so the gap between the help you're getting and your actual rent grew and grew and grew. And that was one of the reasons homelessness has spiraled.
Right.
So the last government, sure, not that far before the election, they actually relinked it. They said again, right, we'll set it at that 30%, but so it covers the bottom third of rents. But they put in a plan to freeze it again from next year. We are saying to this government, please don't do that. You have to keep this linked to actual rents because people come to the doors of food banks partly because they can't buy food because they're trying to pay rent because their housing benefit doesn't give them enough to pay their rent. So keeping that in place. And similarly, the support that's in place for disabled people, the previous government had a plan to cut some of the support for disabled people, not those who are already on benefits, but those who are coming on. And we want reassurance from this government they are not going to continue to do that. Because, you know, about 7 in 10 people coming to food banks already are disabled. The level of hunger and hardship disabled people face is absolutely appalling. Wow. So anything that cuts that support for future people is going to make the problem worse. So those are the kind of 3 things we're saying. We know it's tough, but here are 3 things you can do which will help now and also show all of us in the country their seriousness about this, that they want to make progress. And we will work with them through the rest of the Parliament to get longer term measures in place. But we do want to see that in the first budget.
It sounds like such an awful situation because I've heard people say about countries that you can judge a country on how well it takes care of its weakest people and the most marginalized people. And to hear something like you say, that the disabled people are treated as they are, it's so upsetting and and it sounds like people both disabled and not, they get into a spiral of benefits, loans, repayments, and it's about breaking that cycle once and for all. But I'm sure it's not as simple as it seems. But how much hope do you have for the new government? I mean, obviously, it's early days um, for, for the new government. Some people seem hopeful by them, some people are not. For example, I've got in mind, that there's a great, a lot of people would like them to lift the 2-child cap on child payments. And I think Gordon Brown, former president, have said that, they can lift 1 million children out of poverty almost overnight. But the government seems pretty adamant that they're not going to do that right now. I wonder how you feel about that, and if you have hope for the new government.
So yes, I do definitely have hope. And I think the things that I've seen that give me hope, so the fact that they've come in having made some quite explicit commitments on this issue, that's a good start. And the fact that they are repeating those in government, because you always kind of think you have certain things in the manifesto. One thing you watch for is as a party moves from campaigning into governing, are they still reiterating those commitments? And we have seen very strong signs they are. I think we've had a couple of good things so far. So the Household Support Fund, which is the pot of money in England that essentially enables local authorities to provide local crisis support services of different kinds. Now that was it was actually set up in the pandemic, but has a much longer term use. But what has happened to it is it's always been done very short term. So it's been set up for a year, or and then everyone's campaigned for it to carry on, and they've said, okay, you'll have another 6 months, you'll have another 6 months. So as this government came into power, it was due to end again at the end of this September.
Right.
Now, we've said, many people were saying to them kind of on day one, you've got to extend this. It's not perfect, but if you let this expire, about 60% of local authorities are using it to fund local crisis services. Things will simply fall over in communities. Um, and they have extended it. So we had an announcement a week or so ago. So that has been extended for another 6 months, which is what we asked for, to give time to design a longer term replacement. So that's one tangible thing. And they didn't wait until the last couple of days. They at least did it early in September. The other thing that we were pleased to see, so the King's Speech, where the government set out what it wants to do in terms of legislation, that had quite a few of the things that we have been asking for, that were in our manifesto we had for the election. So improving workers' rights, improving security at the bottom end of the labour market, improving renters' rights, so people are not under constant threat of homelessness, improving the kind of regulation of quality in the private rented sector, because people end up living in the most appalling situations. And there were some other smaller measures, but so that when we looked at that King's Speech, I thought, okay, they're actually planning to take action on quite a few of the long-term drivers. But I think we have to be realistic that the size of the problem we're facing, we're not going to solve it overnight.
No.
But also, this is a government under pressure from lots of quarters. So it is part of what we need to do is actually keep campaigning, keep the pressure up, so that the things we want to see don't slip off the agenda because there's so many other pressures. So that's why, we have so many members of the public joining us to campaign. We have other organisations. That kind of public campaigning is going to be really important, because when the rubber hits the road inside government and they are having to make tough choices, if we are both offering solutions and making it clear publicly that how urgent this is, how important it is to the country, that will help get those things over the line. But it is going to be a tough few years for everybody, for people in government and for those of us who are trying to kind of achieve the changes that we know will make a difference.
Yeah, it must be very difficult to keep going and keep campaigning, because it's going to be a very long term change to happen. That and I suppose personally, I think what keeps you going, because I would imagine in your job, you must come across some desperate poverty that our people just don't see, and it must be difficult.
Yeah, and I think even more so for all of our food banks out in communities.
Yeah.
And talking to both the staff and volunteers, it's one of those things I think people don't talk about that much, but the way that people who are in their communities supporting people are hearing often quite traumatic stories over and over again. And that, if you are sitting week in, week out, and you are supporting people who are going through just very, very difficult things, that actually takes a toll on people's own health, their mental health, their well-being. So one of the many things that we support our network with is helping them support volunteers and staff to keep going, because you're right, and it is, thinking this is a marathon, not a sprint. But I think that the things that I think are really inspirational are seeing the difference our food banks are making on the ground.
Yeah.
So both daily in people's lives, but also the way that many of our food banks in their local areas, they are talking to the local authority, to other service providers about the changes that can be made locally so people get the support earlier and don't, because it's clearly crazy that somebody can come to a food bank and that's when they get debt advice or benefit
Yeah.
advice. You shouldn't have to come to a food bank.
No.
So lots of our food banks are working with other organisations locally to say, look, can we understand together what was this person's journey? Who could have stepped in earlier so they would have got this help before they were unable to afford food and essentials? So that, and just being able to see some of those things actually take effect is really, really inspirational. And seeing the public support, when we had a
Yeah.
petition and we had 100,000 people join, the numbers of people who are joining the campaigning, feeling that, we are standing with thousands and thousands of people out there in their communities and nationally, that's where our strength comes from, isn't it? All of us as individuals,
Yeah.
you take strength from
Yeah.
standing with others to
Yeah.
achieve these
Of
things.
course. And much as nobody wants anybody to have to rely on food banks, and ultimately would like there to be no food banks. But it sounds like there's also a real way. There's almost a good kind of human aspect to them, and they bring people together, they bring a community together in a really positive, forceful way. And there's there's very few prospects or opportunities elsewhere in the community that happens in such an intense and viable way. And would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think there is something, kind of for me, if you thinking, thinking into the future, if all of us together manage to achieve some of those kind of big changes that mean most people have enough money in their pockets to afford food and essentials, then you think, there are 40,000 volunteers out there who are helping in food banks, all the staff, all these little community organizations. And what could those people be doing with their time and their energy if they weren't having to work out how to source enough food to feed people and pack it up? And so, I mean, it's, the food banks we work with are incredibly diverse, but talking to some of them, they can really see a future where they're thinking, okay, we can, if we aren't having to provide the food bit because people can afford it, we can spend more time doing the cups of tea and the peer support and
Yeah,
tackling loneliness and connecting people with services. And actually, one of the constant tensions for food banks is how you carve out the time to do that relational support with people when you've got a queue of people out the door who all have to go home with a bag of food. And, if we can together lift that pressure so people don't need those bags of emergency food, people will still need community connections, and the people in their communities can be focusing on that rather than having to juggle the food bit with the more relational support, which I think it's the real gold dust in communities.
yes, it is a good design, and I think it's really lacking in our communities. And it would be wonderful if like say we could take away the food aspect because people can afford their own food and think what we can achieve for our communities. You know, particularly for to tackle things like loneliness, loneliness is a real epidemic, and it'd be great to tackle that. Yeah, let's hope the new government uh, will start to change things. I have hope for them as well. But I suppose, they've come on a massive, massive expectation upon them. But it's like you said, they won't meet overnight.
Yeah.
But it will take time. We'll get there though.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, from our point of view, food bank need has pretty much doubled in 5 years.
Yeah.
Can we halve it in the next 5 years? And that wouldn't be enough because we need to bring it down to as close to zero, but that would be a pretty amazing thing to achieve over this 5 years.
Yeah, that'd be great. Let's hope so. Let's hope so. I was gonna tell you before I go. I was gonna tell you how I heard about the Trussell Trust. I was I was wanting to buy a ticket to see Squeeze in
Oh,
concert, and I noticed that the tickets, the proceeds of the concerts were all going to the Trussell Trust. And I didn't know who the Trussell Trust was, but I didn't get a ticket. I didn't manage to get a ticket, but I found out who the Trussell Trust was. So I'm pretty grateful for that.
yes, absolutely. And we get amazing support from the public. We've also got quite a lot of companies and other organizations and people in the arts who are just amazing in that how much they support us. We are very, very grateful.
That's super, but yeah. But let's hope that they won't be needed for too much
Absolutely.
longer. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
And so, Helen, thank you very much again for doing this. I've really enjoyed our discussion today, and it's great to always bring to the fore of our minds the poverty and the people struggling. Yeah, I think it's really valuable, and thank you very much indeed.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been really, really good to be here. And it's always brilliant when people cover what we're doing, what we want. It's an amazing thing. So thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks.